It's a pleasure to be in the space with you. I know it's been a long and I hope a very productive day for you. I know just in the few minutes that I've been here, I've already made some incredible connections. I know that is part of the work that we're doing, the work of networking. So my name is Walter Conwell, and I wear many hats, but I'm primarily coming to you as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Morehouse School of Medicine. I'm also a practicing pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine physician. So if there are any questions afterwards as far as the work I do in the clinical realm, definitely happy to talk about that. But my main goal for today is to talk with you about the construct of cultural humility. We'll get the slides up in a moment. So this topic is incredibly important and I think very timely. As we think about our care, our service for the underserved. Very often, people will spend a lot of time talking about the importance of cultural competency. And over the past, 15 to 20 years, that definitely has come in vogue. But this notion of cultural humility, we think is far more important. So forgive me, I am going to walk around. I hate actually being stuck behind a podium. But because I'm an educator, we're going to start first with some objectives. By the end of this talk, I hope that you'll be able to understand the importance of culturally humble healthcare, or I'll say culturally humble communication more broadly. Recognize how cultural humility differs from cultural competency, and identify at least one aspect of cultural humility that you can incorporate into your work as a professional. Let's start first with the why. Why are we even concerned about this concept of cultural humility? Well, when we think about who is caring for our patients, who is caring for our community, by and large, those who are delivering care don't reflect the diversity of the community itself. And I know in many ways I'm preaching to the choir, but to make the point very clear, if we look at all STEM related professions, so science, technology, engineering, medicine professions, only 9% of those individuals are Black, only 8% are Hispanic. And the vast majority of those individuals are white, and even more so as we look at the healthcare related fields. Now, specifically, when we think about clinicians and think about physicians, only 6% of physicians currently in practice, and approximately the same number who are coming out of medical school are Black, and only around 11% are what we refer to as people of color. Now, that mismatch between the workforce and the community has real consequences. As we think about the quality of care that's being delivered, as we think about the outcomes that may result from that. And can we advance the slide? Oh, thank you. So specifically, this was a study published a number of years ago that looked at the perceptions and the beliefs of white medical students, white fellows and residents, and white clinicians, as far as the perception of pain, or how they believed Black patients perceived pain. And by and large, these individuals believed that Black patients felt less pain than white patients. They believed that Black patients would or communicated pain to a lesser degree, and that directly correlated to the amount of pain medication that was delivered. Now, it's interesting when we think about this notion of biologic differences between Black people and white people. It has its origins, it has its stem, its genesis, dating all the way back to slavery. There was actually books written about the ailments of those who were enslaved, and particularly the notion of rascality, that these enslaved Black people had insensitivity of the nerves. And that justified then the amount of physical pain or physical abuse that they were given. So those same notions from enslavement carry on into today in the perception of those who are caring for Black and Brown communities. It also spills over into research, and definitely I know we know much about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Many know about the story of Henrietta Lacks and how even today the biomedical research industrial complex is still benefiting from her sales. How many people know about the Guatemala syphilis study, which only came to broader light during the 1990s? So there's a long history of this, and the diversity of the STEM workforce definitely reflects and contributes to these disparities that we see. Now, one topic that we talk much about is the importance of focusing not only on the downstream access to healthcare and how that contributes to health outcomes, but also on the social determinants of health, these midstream and upstream factors that taken together actually determine 80 to 90% of the health of individuals and communities. So just to rewind that a little bit, we know that just having access to a physician, having concordance between your identity and the identity of that physician, even in the best case scenario, that only determines 10 to 20% of your health and the health of your community. The other 80 to 90% is determined by whether or not you have a job, whether or not you have a place to live, whether or not you have a good education, these midstream to upstream factors. So I make that point because although we are focusing during this talk on the downstream factor, this notion of culturally humble care, I don't want us to lose sight of the importance of these other factors. But let's get to the how of it. So we know that diversity within the workforce is important. And we know the good work that's being done by the Morehouse School of Medicine, by many of your institutions to diversify that workforce. But we know also that we have to make sure that the larger workforce is also delivering quality of care that our community deserves. And that's why we are fostering or encouraging the fostering of cultural humility. So what is cultural humility? It's the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is open to others in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are the most important to that person. So let's rewind that a little bit. What are we trying to say here? So when we interact with other people, we are coming to them with a mental map of what we believe is important to them and who we believe they are. And that mental map is determined by what we see before us. It could be determined by how we perceive their racial ethnic identity, how we perceive their gender identity, how do we perceive their ability status. But those may not be well, one, we may not be accurate in our perception, and two, those may not be the aspects of identity that are the most important to them. Maybe they are a first-generation student. Maybe they are a parent. Maybe they are differently abled in a way that you can't perceive. Maybe they have an invisible disability. Maybe they're a veteran. So we're coming to them and we're distilling them down to just one or two things without giving them the opportunity to express who they are, what's important to them, and the values associated with those identities. Now, this notion of being open, providing the space, providing the grace for someone to bring their full self is very different than this construct of cultural competence that many of us have been indoctrinated into. So cultural competency came or was developed during the 1990s as a way to make things a bit more palatable to the establishment. This notion that if you are interacting with a Black person, you're interacting with a differently able person, that this is the checklist of items you need to keep in mind. These are the things that you need to do in order to deliver good care to them. And although well-intentioned, unfortunately, cultural competency has too often serve to reinforce stereotypes instead of dispelling those stereotypes. I think it would be best if I allowed those who coined the construct of cultural humility to explain this a bit better. So if we can play the video.
One word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually.
If I had to encapsulate cultural humility or the whole concepts of cultural humility, it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
Escuchar.
Being. You.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal, yes? Our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
Cultural humility is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Tervalon and I conceptualized 3 dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often tried to call me anything but African American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
An African-American nurse is caring for a middle-aged Latino woman several hours after the patient had undergone surgery. A Latino physician on a consult service approached the bedside and, noting the moaning patient, commented to the nurse that the patient appeared to be in a great deal of post-operative pain. The nurse summarily dismissed his perception.
Well, actually, if we can play the last little bit of that. Yeah, there you go.
Informing him that she took a course in nursing school in cross-cultural medicine and knew that Hispanic patients overexpressed the pain that they're feeling. The Latino physician had a difficult time influencing the perspective of this nurse. who focused on her self-proclaimed cultural expertise.
It was curious to this Latino physician who, first of all, was Latino, not like all, in his case, not like all Mexican Americans know everything there is to know about Mexican American patients. That wasn't it, but he might have been a resource for that African American nurse in that moment that she didn't feel like she needed, again, because she had bought into this notion of competence, of cultural competence.
The distinction between cultural humility and cultural competence was that we were in a process and a relationship that had many other layers to it, and that we were less comfortable with even the term of competence in a way that I think people understand well, and that it implies, especially for people who are providers and are trained in academia, that you are then all-knowing and all-powerful. And we felt like that was not what was happening for us as we were learning from community and understanding in a very practical way how families were coming to the hospital and feeling as if they really were not being heard from their own heritage and history, and how that impacted what they came to the hospital with that we didn't know anything about, hadn't even a clue about. For us, this is part of the humility piece of it, getting to understand that, not trying to humiliate you, not trying to make you feel bad, trying to help us all understand that that life is like this, and to, in a certain sense, be really happy about not knowing.
You can pause it there.
In April of 1990.
Move on to the next slide, please. So I hope you could appreciate from that video the key elements that Dr. Tervalan and Dr. Mary Garcia initially coined. So this notion of the importance of lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. In many ways, that's the heart of not only cultural humility, but humility itself, right? If anyone says that they are humble, it usually means that they aren't. Humility is a journey, it's not a destination. This notion of understanding and ultimately addressing the power imbalances that are present in any interaction that you're having. Lastly, the institutional accountability that's needed, and then subsequent authors have added on the importance of developing mutually beneficial relationships, which is a core part of the work that I think all of us do. So in the time that we have, I won't be able to go into detail about all these, but I would like to highlight the first two. This notion of lifelong learning and self-reflection. And one of the things I encourage you to do is to take the time to reflect upon how you are coming into the space. Before you can understand, engage with someone else, you have to first understand yourself beyond perhaps the narrow lens that the world views you in. One exercise that might be helpful in doing so is the circles exercise. And I try to use this frequently with my learners in my faculty. I'll walk you through it using myself as an example. In the center, you see my name, Walter Dante Conwell. I don't have the time to take you through the whole story of my name, but there is a story there. I will tell you in brief that Walter is a family name. It's also a Germanic name that means great leader, and that was something that my mother wanted to pass on to me, this notion of being a great leader. Dante is actually a shortened form of the Latin name Durante, which means enduring, and that was another concept that my mother wanted to pass on to me. Conwell is an interesting name. It's a shortened form of the Irish name McConville, and the McConville clan was present in Northern Ireland, but there was a part of that family that moved to England. Eventually, they shortened their name to Conwell, and some immigrated to North America and became enslavers in South Carolina. And that's where the story of my family, at least on my father's side, began in actually South Carolina, sorry. My pronouns are he, him. If I had to communicate the four identities that are the most important to me, the first identity I would communicate to you is my identity as a Black man. Now I say that though, appreciating that if I was on a desert island by myself, my Blackness wouldn't be the first thing that comes to my mind because it wouldn't be salient in that context. But within the United States context, My Blackness will impact the way I navigate this world. I can go from being a critical care doctor in the ICU, having a lot of power, a lot of privilege, take off my white coat and walk outside, and I go into a context where I have significantly less power and privilege, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So I understand the weight associated with my Blackness, but I also understand and appreciate the power and the joy that's associated with my Blackness. One other point about my Black identity, because of the reach of race and racism as we currently understand it, I also understand that if I'm in Brazil, if I'm in South Africa, if I'm in India, the color of my skin will impact the way that I can navigate all those spaces. The next identity I would share with you is my identity as a family head. And what I mean by that, I'm not only the head of my immediate family, but there are probably 4 to 5 households across this country that depend upon me for leadership, depend upon me for financial support, from the Carolinas to Colorado and California. And I'm only 40 years old, well, actually 41 years old. So that tells you something as well. The fact that I'm the oldest man in my family who can serve the role as a family head. And that definitely is connected to my context growing up in Gary, Indiana. We're outside of Chicago. I don't know if we have any Chicagoland folks here, but if you want to understand Gary, you just understand the south side of Chicago, everything you've heard about it. You pick it up and move it 20 miles to the east and compress it into a city a fourth of the size, and that's Gary. It's one of the most segregated parts of the country, one of the most impoverished parts of the country. And that was the context when I grew up, in which I grew up in. And that directly impacted my community, my family, and led to me, again, being the oldest man in my family who can serve the role as a family head. So I understand the context, the weight associated with that, but also the privilege associated with being a family head. Understand and would communicate my identity as an educator. And in years past, I would put there that I was a physician or a physician educator, but I've come to appreciate that regardless of the space that I'm in, whether I'm in the ICU helping patients with COVID, whether I'm in the sleep clinic helping patients with narcolepsy or sleep apnea, whether I'm in the community or helping undergrad or high school students, I primarily interact with others and support others as an educator. Again, there's a weight associated with that, but an incredible privilege associated with that. Lastly, I would communicate my identity as a Christian generally, and specifically as a Jehovah's Witness. And that identity, so the Christian identity and the values associated with that, particularly the value of agape love, is so core and foundational to who I am and all the work that I do, particularly the work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's how I would choose to introduce myself if I could. But I recognize that when I go into the space, these aren't the identities that most people would choose for me. So I encourage you at some point to reflect upon your identities, the ones that you would introduce yourself with if you could. And then also reflect on whether or not it's difficult to choose just 4 identities. And why might that be? Well, it's because we know that we are more than 4 identities. We're more than 40 identities, probably more than 400 identities if we really thought about it. And distilling ourselves down to 4 feels very uncomfortable. But that's exactly what happens when we go into other spaces, isn't it? And that's exactly what we do to other people. We distill them down to less than 4. We distill them down oftentimes to just 1. So again, understanding how we are showing up in the space and how we navigate the space may help us to understand others. I also encourage you, as you go through that exercise, to think about the power and the privilege that might be associated with each one of those identities, because we all have power and privilege. I oftentimes say that if you're having a conversation about power and privilege, it usually means that you have it. But what is power and privilege? Well, one definition of power is the potential to influence others either with or without formal authority. A definition of privilege is advantage and or power that's afforded to someone as a result of their identity. And importantly, power and privilege is often invisible to those who have them. I oftentimes will illustrate this point by saying that For those who identify as women in the room, if you had to put your identities in those circles, how many of you would put some aspect of womanhood in those circles? And usually the vast majority of women would. I mean, a mother, a sister, a woman, etc. And then I often will flip that to those who identify as men, and how many will put some aspect of manhood. And very few men would put an aspect of manhood, because it's not the identity that is most salient to them. Because ultimately, the identities that give us the most power and privilege are the ones that are invisible to us. If you want to understand your power and privilege, understand what's normal in your life, understand what isn't in need of constant navigation, understand the normalcy, because where there is ease, where there is comfort, that's where your power and privilege is. I think this is well illustrated by Dr. Kamara Jones, who's one of our faculty members at the Morehouse School of Medicine. Can we play this video briefly?
The second story, Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. This was also from my time back as a medical student in California. And I had been studying with some friends. It was getting late, we'd missed dinner. And so we went into town to get something to eat. And we walk into a restaurant and we sit down, we order our food is served, and here we are eating. And that's not remarkable. Many of you have had that experience. And I wouldn't have thought anything more about it or be talking about it today, except that I looked up and I noticed a sign. And that sign was provided me a profound insight about racism. So what did the sign say? The sign said open. Now, I could have thought nothing more about that, right? I was sitting at the table of opportunity eating with a sign that proclaimed open to me. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I realized that in fact, people who were hungry but just a few feet away from me on the other side of the sign would not be able to come in, because in fact, now the restaurant was closed due to the hour. And I realized that racism and other systems of inequity structure open-closed signs in our society. And it's important for us to know something about the two-sided nature of these signs. It's important for us to understand how these signs, how racism and all of the other isms create a dual reality, where on one side, people who are in the side, for any of us, it's difficult for us to recognize any system of inequity that is privileging us. So for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white people in this country to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the world context. Yet for those on the other side of the sign, they are very well aware of the two-sided nature of the sign, because it's proclaiming close to them, and yet they can see through the window and see that people are eating on the other side. So back inside the restaurant, I understand that people might ask, does racism really exist? Is there really a two-sided sign? Because in fact, it's hard to know when all you ever see is open. It's a privilege, in fact, not to have to know about the two-sided nature of the sign. But once you do know, you can act. You don't have to act, but you can choose to act. And the knowledge about racism and its continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation is actually empowering. Racism is a system.
So if we can stop the video and go on to the next slide.
It's not an individual character flaw or a personal moral.
So I encourage you to reflect with that in mind on the identities that do give you more or less power or privilege. The identities that may be intersectional, and intersectionality as defined by Kimberly Crenshaw is the notion of combined marginalization. How if you have multiple identities that are combined, they are more than the sum of their parts. How, for example, being a Black woman, the experience of a Black woman is greater than the experience of either being Black or being a woman. And think about perhaps a Black woman who is a veteran, a Black woman who is differently abled, a Black woman of trans experience, and how her experience may differ from the experience of those who may have more power or privilege. And then once you understand your power and privilege, my final question to you, or what I encourage you to do, is reflect on how you can use your power and privilege to center the voices of those who have less power and privilege. So in the work that you are doing. It could be learners, it could be patients, it can be community members. And if you can do that, that ultimately is how you can develop cultural humility. In closing, I would like to just touch upon the final two aspects of cultural humility, which are developing mutually beneficial partnerships and ensuring institutional accountability. And I would like to share with you an exciting partnership that we have now at the Morehouse School of Medicine. Now, as you may or may not know, coming out of Reconstruction, there were more than a dozen Black medical schools created, along with the more than 200 historically Black colleges and universities. Most of those Black medical schools closed around 1910 as a result of a report called the Flexner Report, which set forth the current standard of medical education, 2 years of biomedical education, 2 years of clinical education. It was also that report laced with racist ideas and articulated a very narrow view of the role of Black physicians in America, that they should humbly, quote unquote, serve their community as sanitarians. That basically the role of a Black physician was to prevent the illnesses of the Black community from getting to the majority community. So as a result of that report, only 2 Black medical schools survived, and that was Howard University and Meharry Medical College. And for the next 50 years, those 2 Black medical schools went on to produce 90+% of all Black physicians, Black dentists, and Black scientists in this country. I can almost guarantee you that if you know a Black doctor that trained before the 1950s, they trained at one of those 2 schools. And that decision, and this gets back to the notion of the political determinants of health, that political and policy decision is still impacting us today. In order to address these issues, the Morehouse School of Medicine has formed a mutually beneficial partnership with Common Spirit Health. And you may or may not be familiar with Common Spirit, but it's a relatively new entity that was formed from the merger of Dignity Health and CHI. Is now the largest or the next to largest nonprofit health system in the whole country, with more than 150,000 employees across greater than 20 states. And this partnership, which we've coined the More in Common Alliance, will allow the Morehouse School of Medicine, with an investment of over $115 million, will allow the Morehouse School of Medicine to open up 5 new regional medical school campuses across the country. From Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Lexington, Kentucky, to Virginia, Mason, and Seattle, Washington, California as well as 10 new GME, which are residency and fellowship programs. At steady state, it means that we will produce more than 300 new physicians and physician assistants per year. Now, I like to point out to people how historic this truly is. So the Morehouse School of Medicine already has 3 training sites here in Georgia. With our 5 new sites across the country, that takes us to 8. If you consider our sister medical schools, Charles Drew, Meharry, and Howard, that takes us to 11. And the potential new Black medical school that's being opened by Morgan State and potentially Xavier as well, that takes us to over a dozen. It takes us back to where we were at the turn of the 20th century. So this is truly historic, and this is a mutually beneficial partnership. So with that, I'd like to close by encouraging you to reflect upon what you learned and what we discussed today, this notion of cultural humility, and how you might commit to incorporating and fostering these practices in your work as a professional. So what will you commit to do? What concrete steps you might take? And what will you share with your contacts, both personal and professional, beyond this? So thank you very much for your time, for your attention. I'm definitely happy to take any questions that you might have. And if not, we'll turn it over to Ms. Broussard.